in my view, that stopped short of a real solution, which is you have to blow apart the teacher salary schedule and pay people what they're worth, pay them in the same way that everyone else is paid.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Education Roundtable. Today, we have a very special guest with us on the show. I am joined by Dr. Robert Luebke, who is the director of the Center for Effective Education under the John Locke Foundation. Bob is one of the preeminent researchers here in North Carolina and is also one of Cowan's founding members. So, Bob, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Good to be here, Bryce. Appreciate it.
Yeah, looking forward to our discussion. And for our listeners who don't know, we are sort of in the heat of North Carolina's legislative session right now. And there are a few topics here that I want to discuss. But before we dive into that, you published a piece today that caught my eye, talking about an issue in North Carolina's biggest public school district, Wake County Public Schools, and some of the ongoing heating and air issues that are affecting classrooms there. So can you give us an update on that maybe and talk about potentially what could have been done sooner to remedy this issue?
Sure, Bryce. Let me give a relevant background. Everybody knows during COVID, states were giving a lot of federal money, about $200 billion in all to all states. North Carolina got about $6.2 billion to deal with COVID-related issues. Over 3 years, North Carolina got about $6.2 billion, and about 434 million of that went to Wake County schools for COVID relief. That was broadly interpreted. It could be used for a variety of things. One of the biggest issues, obviously, was to address transmission of the virus in schools. One of the biggest needs for that was in the areas of, air conditioning, HVAC, just to make sure that the virus wasn't being transmitted in schools. That was obviously a need for many schools. And as we know, from the last couple of years, there's been a particular problem in Wake County schools with having a large HVAC backlog for repair and maintenance issues. I think in the piece I wrote today, it was listed as over 200 million. My point on that was that Wake County Public Schools and any public school that got COVID money could have legitimately used that to address any COVID transmission via HVAC. Mm-hmm. They could use it for repair and maintenance. They did not. And how I know that is because each month school districts would have to complete how they spent their COVID money. And that money is the data on that is publicly available, and I have a link to it. The State Department of Public Instruction has to post that data. And as you see, as I note in the link in the article, they didn't spend any money on specifically on COVID contracts. Now, before I posted it, I did reach out to Wake County Public Schools for a comment from them, and Lisa Luton said that they did spend some money on HVAC repair and maintenance from capital costs. And I asked, how much was it, and where can I find it? And she had put a link in there to 93 million, but it was thrown in with about 4 or 5 other items, and there was no specific reference to how much was actually spent. Mm-hmm. So I'm assuming after I asked for that twice, it wasn't a large amount. If it was, I'm sure she would have answered it that way. But my point is, the school district now, as we learned from a number of press reports, is now considering using budgets that were, allocated for computers for kids, mm-hmm. and using some of those funds to help address the HVAC situation in schools. And I think, taxpayers should be up in arms about this, because there was more than enough money provided for school districts to address these needs. What we need to do is remember that school districts could legitimately spend this money in a variety of ways. Wake County spent most of their money, in fact, a little over three-quarters of it on salaries and benefits. And that's higher than any other school district in North Carolina. Now, that means they weren't spending it on other things like HVAC and other capital needs that they now say they have. So I think they should be held accountable for that. Why did they do that? How much money did they actually spend on it? Those are questions that I think taxpayers deserve answers to.
One of the things that you mentioned, I mean, and we know this, and I know this working in a previous research role, is when you get temporary one-time funding from the federal government, what you do not want to do is spend that on recurring expenses, expenses that are going to come up every budget cycle, expenses that you're going to have to pay for in the future once that one-time money runs out. And where that money is beneficial is on critical needs and projects, such as an HVAC system. And so I'm glad you did your reporting on that, obviously. Let's zoom out a little bit and talk about opportunity scholarships. Of course, these are North Carolina's school choice program that the Locke Foundation has done excellent work supporting. Your colleague, Caitlin Shepard, recently wrote about sustained demand for the program. Can you talk about what the latest application figures are and sort of what that tells you about parents' desire for more educational freedom in North Carolina?
Yeah, I believe we've got about 80,000 new applicants in the system. If the last numbers, if I could recollect correctly from the last numbers which were issued last week. So, I mean, what does that tell me? I mean, there is a great demand for parental choice, for the ability of parents to choose the best school for their child, whether that be private, charters, or whatever. I mean, parents want to choose that. In this case, with regards to the Opportunity Scholarship, it provides a voucher depending upon household income that can be used for private school tuition. We believe that this program is going to continue to grow. We still witness a lot of people who are unaware of the program further out of Raleigh, further out of Charlotte. And so I think as people gain more publicity about it, that the numbers will probably continue to go up. But people are dissatisfied with the options that their kids have right now. We did a poll I think it was in January, with regards to our school choice poll, where about 55% of respondents said they were dissatisfied with their local public school.
Yeah.
That's up about 7%, 7 percentage points from the previous year. So there's a lot of dissatisfaction out there. And, that's helping to fuel, obviously, support in the options for Opportunity Scholarship Program.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to drive parents to look for new options, and whether that's a charter school, a home school, a micro school, or a program that can provide them the financial resources that they need to enroll their kids in a private school. And obviously, the main sort of objective for us at Callan is sort of realizing that even with all these great school choice options, which we support, right? We want parents to have the most opportunities that they can have to enroll their child in a learning environment that is completely suited to their needs. But the reality is that most parents will continue to enroll their kids in their local neighborhood public school. And so we've got to do the hard work of to make sure that the public school system is strong and healthy in providing a quality education as well. As the state works to fund that program, and speaking of public education, there are other big ticket items in the budget that we should discuss. The big one right now is a proposal for a 22% pay raise for teachers in the upcoming school year. So this was a bill that was filed last month. It has growing bipartisan support. Can you talk about the teacher pay issue in North Carolina, where the state sits perhaps compared to some of its neighbors, and how you think lawmakers arrived at this particular figure?
Well, it's a constant, teacher pay is a constant piggyback game, where, states pass laws to kind of one up some of their neighbors, and then the state that was one up passed another one. And where North Carolina is relative to its neighboring states is also often a function of when that picture was taken. Because there's a lot of change oftentimes from year to year. So right now, North Carolina is about in the middle. If you took a snapshot right here of its partners in the Southeast. And what I mean mainly by that is Virginia, if you take a poll of Virginia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, areas in the Southeast, most of the areas that North Carolina kind of immediately competes with teachers for, say those 4 or 5 states, North Carolina's in about the middle of the pack there, beneath Virginia and Georgia, but a little bit above others. But there's always a lot of jockeying based on where we are in a legislative position or the legislative session in these various states, and that is often influenced what state proposals look like. North Carolina has wanted to be at least in the middle. Some legislators say that we should be at the top of the Southeast and have suggested proposals to do so. I think most of us are probably more comfortable being in the top third to a half. And so a lot of the proposals are in that area. The proposal you referenced from Representative Perret recommends a 22% pay increase for teachers, which is substantive. What's also significant about that is she's a Republican and one of the co-chairs of, I believe, of the House Education Committee. So that raised a few eyebrows. She puts it forward with the intention of trying to remedy some of the problems with attracting teachers. And also there's a provision in there to, I believe, try to address some of the problems with the teacher allotment, which is a longer term problem, which I applaud. But as far as the actual amount itself, the 22%, that's a lot. I don't think it's sustainable, nor do I think the Senate would probably go for it. I also don't think if it's a provision that seeks to address a lot of the teacher pay issues, which I think is laudable, it doesn't really get to the heart of the issue, in my view. And the heart of the issue is that teacher pay is not tied, we don't tie it to outcomes or the value that teachers bring to the classroom. It's tied to years of experience and credentials. Mm-hmm. And so it takes it out of the normal economic equation. Teachers are oftentimes, they point out that, well, engineers or doctors or accountants don't get paid better, and their pay structure is better than what we're dealing with. Pay structure is better than teachers. Well, it's different in many senses because this issue, the contract was, even though North Carolina doesn't bargain collectively, it's essentially a union contract that creates salary steps and provides additional salary supplements for, say, additional credentials like a doctorate or National Board of Professional Teacher Certification. Those contracts are essentially negotiated by teachers unions, and they benefit teachers. They benefit the unions more than they benefit individual teachers, because what happens is 5 years in, you can be a great teacher, but you realize you have a ceiling. You're only going to make this much your 5th year. And that's a problem in many areas, and it's contributed to the fact that about 50% of our graduates in teaching are out of the field 5 years after they graduate because they see that they can't really make as much as they'd like. Now, we've tried to address that by on the front end trying to increase, the steps, so to speak, on the front end. And we can take steps, no pun intended, to improve that. But in my view, that stops short of a real solution, which is you have to blow apart the teacher salary schedule and pay people what they're worth, pay them in the same way that everyone else is paid, which is by by someone ascertaining how much value you bring to the classroom. Now, people will say, well, how do we do that?
Mm-hmm.
It's possible, like any other field, you operate in a market. There's a market for teachers. You can provide salary ranges for each position. It's not difficult to do. The problem has been people have been unwilling to do it. That's the issue there. And I think that would provide a much better salary program for teachers that would be more fair and provide more incentives than what the current structure is, which in many ways limits salary increases and also disincentivizes excellence because oftentimes really good teachers are paid the same as not so good teachers.
Bob, I'm curious if you have a specific idea of how you would measure the value that the teacher is creating for the classroom, or how that you would evaluate that teacher's performance. I mean, would you just tie it to annual classroom test scores? Would you do it over an extended period of time? Would you allow for a window in the beginning if a teacher is working in a historically low achieving district? Would you allow a grace period in the beginning for that teacher to experiment with different things to begin to bring those test scores up? I'm curious, sort of on the nuts and bolts side of things. How would you?
Yeah, we can do
formulate
that.
it?
We can do that. Every year, every teacher gets evaluated. Those concerns are brought up in every evaluation. There are teachers that teach in predominantly low income areas, and they have to be evaluated. There are teachers that are in schools that are predominantly higher income students that come from stable families and are really good students. How does that teacher impact that classroom? Good principals should be able to tease that out. There are software programs that can also help to assess a teacher's impact on classrooms. Now, none of those tools are perfect and they're all limited. And they do have their strengths, but they should be a combination. You can pick from a combination of tools and be able to answer those questions, in my view. It's more, well, do we want to do this? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a certain fear here, a fear of the unknown, of going to, well, what's going to happen? I mean, what's going to happen if my principal doesn't like me? And, am I not going to get a fair shake on salary? Well, there are ways to address that, due process concerns and things that are already on the books. And I think it can be done. It's just a matter of people realizing there are better ways out there, I think, to pay teachers.
Yeah. I think we know the current system is not working, and however we proceed, we need to change the incentive structure and tie performance and achievement to, some sort of salary schedule. At least build that into the formula where it's currently absent. Finally, I want to discuss an evergreen question here in North Carolina, the school calendar topic, and how it ties into the push for more local control. So to start, to just sort of give the big picture foundation, what is the earliest start date that is currently allowed in North Carolina right now? And do you think 2025 could be the year that lawmakers change it?
Well, you'd have to ask that question. It is like the third, if I recollect correctly, no later than the third, the Friday of the last week of August, as far as starting, no later than that. And I'm not absolutely sure on the start date, but it's because it's the way it's configured. It's an odd date, but it's like the first it's the second week of June, no later than the uh, first Friday at the end of the second week of June, something like that.
But
So it's a defined period. Now there have been exceptions to that for cases of, natural disasters and all that. But I've been here 18 years. School calendar changes have come up every year. I don't remember that there have been as many this year requests for changes. And this issue, I don't think it's really getting the press it deserves from the traditional press because people are really angry about this. And it's an issue that really pits, kind of the tourism industry against local districts. I mean, the reason for it has been that the legislature was lobbied to try to provide a full summer of employment for students that come to the mountains or the beaches to work. And that gift, has pretty much dictated when schools start and when they can end. And a lot of schools are really unhappy with it and getting increasingly so, and have in the last years threatened to challenge that because it really doesn't fit with their optimum schedules. Union County being one about 2 years ago, where they outright have made some public statements that they were going to not comply with it. But at the end, after a couple discussions with officials at the Department of Public Instruction, had finally agreed to do that. But it's an issue that's very intensely felt for obvious reasons, that local schools, who are supposed to determine how and when kids go to school, feel like they can't do that because of this condition forced on them by the state, even though many people feel, and many public officials will, chant the glories of local control. But that hasn't been happening. People feel intensely about it on each side, and the tourism industry says they need staff, young people, to staff, camps in the mountains, beach homes in the summer, and without that, they feel like many of them would go out of business. Now, obviously, schools have their own interests in this as far as optimally wanting to start and when to end. My position on this is, why not let local districts decide this? Why? Because how you feel about this issue is going to be a lot different when you're on the beach and in the mountains than it is if you're in Raleigh or Charlotte or some area where this is not intensely felt. Let the debate be intense, at the beaches or in the mountains, and let them come up with their own decision. I think that's the best way of deciding this. And I also believe that people should be able to decide when their schools start and end. And that would allow them to do that.
Yeah, and look, there are the truth is that the districts have different factors, different conditions, different job markets that require more flexibility. I mean, I totally agree, and I think most parents would agree with the idea of let's decide this issue locally and sort of hash that debate out and then whoever makes the more compelling argument ultimately gets to influence the policy. So, my question is, these tensions have existed for many years at this point. Many people have strong feelings about it. Why has the legislature not relinquished its centralized control of this question and local control generally? Is there a unique funding situation in North Carolina that affords the legislature more control over local education than is typically true in other states?
That's a big and important question, Bryce. My short answer to that is yes. North Carolina is somewhat different. Um, to really answer that, you have to go back to 1933, and there was an act passed called the School Machinery Act. It was right at the Depression, and it was meant to resolve or to help a lot of local school districts who were really struggling with getting tax revenue and even being able to even keep their schools open. So what that did was there was a handshake agreement essentially, and it was written in statute. But what it said was the state will provide the day-to-day instructional costs of local schools, and the local school districts will cover capital and maintenance costs. That was passed in 1933. There have been some changes around the perimeter to improve some things, but that handshake agreement about how costs are different is largely in place. Now, so that means about almost two thirds to maybe 70% of all school costs are covered by the state in North Carolina. That's vastly different than states like in the Northeast or Midwest, where school costs are primarily paid by local property taxes. And hence, a lot of the taxing decisions, a lot of financial decisions are made more at the school district level in those states and less so here because, so much of the money comes from the state. The state has, naturally speaking, had a tight rein on how those costs are distributed and what the expectations would be. There's always been the yin and the yang of, okay, how much how much flexibility do we want to give? Do we want to make some of these block grants and encourage, entrepreneurial activity, encourage creativity among school districts, et cetera, and give them more flexibility on things? There have been times when the legislature has done that more, and it comes and it goes. But that tightening or that control is a function of the way schools are funded, that there's so much revenue that comes from the state, on average about two-thirds of it. And, wherever the revenue comes from is largely those are the people that call the shots. About a quarter of it, comes from local control. That's not insignificant. But when compared to the state, I mean, the state still has the larger voice here.
He who controls the funding is going to dictate the policy in a very significant way.
That's right.
And I know you've written a lot about education funding in North Carolina, and I'm sure you've talked about this sort of unusual system where the state controls an outsized percentage of education funding. And do you see that system changing anytime in the near future? And do you think there's the political will or interest here in Raleigh to reevaluate that system and maybe make local funding a bigger portion of that pie? Or do you see this as the at least in the near future, the way things will continue to be?
I think there's a slow drumbeat to change it. Over the last 15 years, there's been this consensus that there's something wrong with the system. It's not efficient. It's not transparent. There's no way to determine if the money's getting to where we need it to go. There's a lot, and worst of all, there's a lot of inequity in it. A lot of things happen that you know, are unintended. For example, I mean, the largest, most glaring example of this is with regards to teacher allotments. And the state pays the salary and benefits of all teachers. And what happens over time is the more experienced, higher paid teachers end up in, higher income areas. And what happens is the lower income, the areas that are lower income school districts oftentimes have inexperienced teachers who end up, having to teach really challenged kids. And that's a disparity that really is oftentimes getting worse. The other problem with it from the allotment end is this because the state pays for all the salary and benefits of local districts, there's really no incentive for local districts to hold down costs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a severe problem. So people have recognized that. There have been several state reports that have come out, three, four of them major ones since 2007, 2008, that I think policymakers realize we have to change the system. There's a lot of inertia in the legislature, though, because it is probably the largest political lift. We spend more on K-12 schools than any other budget item. And oftentimes, in many districts, the public schools are the largest employer. So there's a hesitancy to really upset the apple cart. Now, um, there are winds that are moving now that I think can help propel this issue. I think a lot of people in the minority, more on the political left, that were really hesitant to address this issue, I think are more open to it now because of differing trends. One of them being the decline in population in a lot of areas is gonna really hurt some of these districts. So I think there are things happening that make me think there will be a groundswell of public support, but that public support is really going to have to help convince legislators that this is the best thing to do right now. That's not the only issue that's ever happened on, but I think it's going to have to come from outside simply because of the factors I just described.
Well, we do know if and when things do start moving on that front that you will be one of the first people to write about it and let us know. And with that, Bob, where can people find you and find more about your work?
Yeah, we are located at John Locke Foundation. Our website is www.johnlocke.org. And more specifically, I work with the Center for Effective Education at John Locke, and my assistant, Caitlin Shepard. We write on all things education in North Carolina. We also work on a number of research grants, but we go out and speak when invited and are happy to help anyone else who wants to learn about any of these issues.
It's great. And we love collaborating with you at Callan. Of course, Callan also under the Locked umbrella. You and Caitlin are a great resource and wealth of information on all things K through 12 education. So I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for speaking with me. Everyone, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Bryce. I enjoyed it.